You're listening to The Voice of Russia. Hello and welcome to In Conversation. I'm Tim Ecott, and today my guest is the prominent economist Vicky Pryce. Vicky Pryce is a former head of the Government Economic Service and a specialist in European economics with visiting professorships at some of Britain's top universities. But she was propelled into the spotlight after a high-profile criminal trial in which she and her ex-husband, the former Energy Secretary Chris Huhne, were charged with perverting the course of justice. Pryce's offence was to take points on her own driving licence when her husband was in danger of losing his own licence for speeding. That offence took place back in 2003, but the trial only took place a decade later after Huhne had left Pryce for another woman. Both Pryce and Huhne went to jail. Now Vicky Pryce is out and has published a book about the economics of keeping people in prison. It's called Prisonomics, Behind Bars in Britain's Failing Prisons. I asked her to begin by describing what it felt like when the cell door banged shut.
I had a very exhausting few weeks, shall I say months, and they do indeed say that you hear the lock on the door because of your cell. And the people go to lie in bed finally and then turn their heads to the wall and spend the night crying their eyes out. Well, I have to admit it didn't happen to me at all. I was so tired that I just got into bed and slept rather well, I have to admit. And I carried on sleeping rather well throughout that time there, perhaps getting it all out of my system.
So it was almost a relief to be taken out of that frenetic period of being on trial and all the media attention. It was almost like switching off.
Perhaps it was. But I think it was more that I was so exhausted. I did then start writing things down, of course, very quickly. I was doing a little bit of that while I was still going through the case in court. But it's quite interesting when you start doing that. In a way, it takes you out of the unbearability of the situation. You can be a little bit more of an observer, and you don't let yourself sink, if you see what I mean. You are able to see what other people are doing, what they're saying, and their stories ended up being so extraordinary that it encouraged me to write the book from a slightly different angle. I was rather impressed by what the system does, in fact, because the prison system has to deal with all sorts of people turning up, with all sorts of problems, with all sorts of vulnerabilities, and they have to deal with it. So it exceeded my expectations. But the girls I met were, on the whole, terribly vulnerable and had terrible lives before. And in a way, they were victims before they were offenders. So you should really look at them with that light rather than necessarily think that they should be spending a lot of time in prison.
Your book obviously delves quite deeply into the statistics behind how many women are in prison, the kinds of things they're in prison for. But of course, another aspect that people imagine goes through one's head, knowing that you're about to be incarcerated, is what are the other inmates going to be like? How will they treat you? Your case, of course, was very high profile. You found that actually staff and prisoners were aware of who you were, didn't you?
Oh, completely. They all knew exactly who I was. In fact, on day 2, when I started going down the corridors, there is such a thing as movement, which is basically a way of getting out of your cell and then going and joining various activities, whether it's the gym or education and so on, which is actually encouraged. Of course, it was very early on for me, so I wasn't signed into any of that, but I managed to get into it anyway and go to various places like health and so on. People would shout from the cells, Vicky Pryce is coming, and would come out of it. And in fact, they'd hug me. Lots of things had been written saying I was going to have a really tough time. But in fact, it was the opposite. They had looked at the trial. I don't know what they thought exactly, but they certainly felt a huge amount of sympathy. And that continued throughout my time in prison, in the closed prison, which is Holloway, where, you get lockups and so on, and in the open prison later on, where, of course, the atmosphere is completely different. But the girls were amazingly helpful, and there was an awful lot of solidarity around.
Do you think that, if you like, celebrity status or awareness of you being in some way a public figure, do you think that softened their attitude, though? Do you think had you just been another person who hadn't had such media attention, that you would have had a tougher time?
It could, of course, work completely the other way. The celebrity status, and if people think, as had been written, that I was rather well off and all that sort of stuff, might have turned people against me. And in fact, a lot was written from the outside saying that is precisely what would happen, but it didn't at all. But I did notice that they were very solicitous of anyone who'd come in. There is a big change which has taken place in Holloway in particular, where there is a very nice reception process, not a particularly nice area, but a process where there are girls who are inmates who get the job of looking after you the moment you arrive and give you food and give you induction. That was introduced by one previous governor in Holloway, and I think that's a great, great success because it shows immediately that people care about how you're going to be able to survive. The last thing that the prison wants is a problem person in their hands. And that is a really important aspect of the whole process. And once you get through that, you realise that, in fact, that happens with everyone. That process existed for me and exists for anyone else who enters Holloway.
Obviously, you got first-hand stories from the other inmates. A lot of these women were suffering not just from being locked up, but from all the things that go with it in terms of their relationships with family. There's something particularly hard, I think you're saying, about being in prison for women because of their role in the family. Is that fair?
It's absolutely awful for so many of them, having been separated from their children, and they get terribly, terribly depressed because the loss of freedom and loss of control is really the greatest punishment that you can give somebody who is, if you like, sort of running a family. And what we find is that the vast majority of children whose mother goes to prison end up moving homes. A number of them go to care. Some, of course, lucky ones, get looked after by relatives and grandparents. And very often, of course, women go to court not expecting to be sentenced, so they haven't made any arrangements at all about their children. They left them with neighbours, assuming that they will get back again in the evening and pick them up. And, of course, you can imagine what ensues when they realise that they're taken straight downstairs after court sentencing.
Quite often those prisons are quite a long way from the home environment, so it's physically difficult even with the limited visiting available. It's difficult for those families to remain in touch.
That's absolutely right. There are very few women prisons and the average distance from their home seems to be something like 57 miles. Very often it's a lot further than that. And that is a problem. It's not just the visiting, of course. It is the fact that a number of the children are taken into care. And that has huge repercussions for the women themselves. But in addition, it's very, very costly for society. So it's not just that there's the cost of keeping someone in prison, which is huge. It's about £56,000 a year for a woman, plus, of course, all the other costs, of the legal costs of getting them there to begin with. But then you have a large number of children who the state has to pay for when they're taken into care or to foster homes. And those children tend to then, as they grow up, become the ones we call NEETs here in the UK, which is basically not in education, employment or training. And very often, by comparison to anyone else who has not been in care, they offend themselves.
And there's a cycle here. If the mother is the one who is criminalised, the knock-on effect for the next generation is to give them a very high chance of becoming criminals themselves.
I think there are some statistics that suggest they're 4 times as likely to commit a crime than other children. And of course, that is a serious problem. The other issue is how educated or uneducated the women are who enter prison. The majority don't have any qualifications at all of women who enter prison. And very often they haven't been employed at all. So we are talking about a sort of part of society which has already been led down, if you like, by the system. And what they do need is better education, very often, of course, to overcome problems of mental illness or drug abuse and overcome also some of the longer psychological problems they have. Because, again, some 53% of women who enter prison have been sexually, physically or emotionally abused as children, and very often that continued afterwards in the relationships just before they committed the crime.
There are other statistics in there. You've said that some 97% of women in jail have experienced at least one traumatic life event. 40% have experienced or will experience a mental health problem in their lives. Over 50% have experienced drug use, and almost 40% of women in prison have attempted suicide at some time in their lives. Did you pick up those things from individuals who you met?
Oh, you saw quite a lot of women who were wandering around in a daze, I have to admit, in Holloway. And when I later heard some of the stories of the people in my open prison, some women who had been in prison for quite some time and were nearing the end of their imprisonment, and therefore were being rehabilitated back into society from the open prison system, I heard an awful lot of stories of how they got there. Admittedly, there are some cases where they say if it hadn't been for prison, they would be dead by now. but there is serious concern about going back to the environment from which they came, particularly if they have children and therefore need to look after them, and they could easily fall back into the habits that they had before. So very often what's really needed is more residential support for mental health problems, better support for drug addiction and so on, and a lot of psychiatric help. Prisons, unfortunately, have been turned, for women anyway, into enormous amateur psychiatric units. Women who leave within a year reoffend very substantially, some 45%, in fact, get reconvicted. The reoffending rate is considerably higher because, of course, they just don't get caught.
I suppose people who've been fortunate enough not to go to prison or to be involved with people who end up in prison tend to assume that one of the purposes of putting people in jail is to punish them and to dissuade them from their crimes. From what you're saying, that doesn't seem to be working terribly well.
But the reoffending rate is very high for men and for women. And in fact, if anything, the statistics suggest that prison encourages more offending than would otherwise be the case. So there are alternatives which seem to be better at reducing the offending rate and the reoffending rate, and which are much, much cheaper, such as community services. And they're tried in many countries, and they're tried here as well. But the population believes that, in general, mainly because of what they've been told by ministers until now, that those punishments are not really harsh enough to make up for what people had done, and therefore prison perhaps is the best thing for them. But once it's explained what those community orders require, and once it's also explained what the women had done and to what extent they perhaps had been leaned on to do whatever they did, opinion differs very significantly, changes into a much more welcoming one for alternatives to prison. And if one were to consider that seriously, the state, in many countries, of course, government is in trouble in terms of overspending, as we're trying to cut back, should find it quite useful to have alternatives which are much cheaper and which reduce the reoffending rate, in some cases very, very substantially.
Presumably, though, you do acknowledge, or do you, that there are some people for whom it is better for society that they are removed from society?
Absolutely. There are quite a lot of violent people who should be in prison, but there aren't very many violent women as such. They are more, in fact, a danger to themselves than to society. And you did quote some figures about women trying to commit suicide in their lives. In prison itself, although women in England and Wales represent about 5% of the total population, they account for about a third of all the incidences we have of self-harm.
You mentioned that a lot of the women in prison are, I suppose it will seem obvious to people, a lot of them are quite poorly educated, in some cases can't even read. You, of course, come from a very different background, highly educated, high-flying career as an economist, a government advisor, former government advisor. Did you feel that protected you from the harshness of prison in a way? Mentally, were you in a better place? Clearly, you were able to process things in some way, but some people might think that would work against you.
It worked in my favour because I knew how the system worked pretty quickly. And if you know what isn't acceptable, you can have a bearable life in it. Quite a lot of girls didn't quite have that ability to see what they needed to do, and therefore got into trouble all the time while in prison, which makes absolutely no sense. Or they would be behaving in a certain way that opened up the possibility of being bullied and therefore having an even worse time. So what I did do is spend quite a lot of time with people who couldn't read and write, and I was quite astonished. I was going quite a lot to faith sessions. There was a multi-faith room in the open prison, which was actually run incredibly well, and which was quite uplifting. I'm not fantastically religious, but also I'm not Church of England, I'm Greek Orthodox. And we would read and then sing hymns. I wasn't terribly familiar with many of them. And I would look around and find that perhaps a third of the congregation there would just sing the hymns, and I was quite impressed that they knew them by heart and they didn't read the books. And it was only later that I realized that they couldn't read. The reason why they didn't have the books in front of them was because it wouldn't make any difference to them at all holding them in front of them. So they had to learn them by heart. So I started getting a bit more involved. I did help a number of girls who were putting together their cases with their solicitors, just to make sure that it was in the right language. and there weren't sort of obvious mistakes. But there would be times when I'd be asked to sign for them various things or look up various things for them, which were on the board, which involved them, because they just couldn't understand it themselves. And there is a very big figure there in terms of women entering prison with serious educational problems.
Mentally, were you able to compartmentalize this idea of being in prison? Did it become a sort of project for you? Because you mentioned that the life experiences of those around you were so vastly different. I mean, TV programs that they watched, things like The Voice, talent shows, things that you presumably had not made part of your life beforehand. Was it almost an anthropological experience for you?
It was a different environment, there's no doubt about that. But I don't watch The Voice out of choice normally. But I didn't. I enjoyed it, funnily enough. It's just that I don't watch very much television. So I didn't feel that it was an issue of us and them, and I suddenly had to mix with people I didn't really know. That wasn't the case at all, because in fact I mixed with all sorts of different people, and I came to the UK with nothing myself and built my life on, without having any connections, worked in hotels and all that sort of stuff that one does to survive.
You mentioned in the book about, for instance, tattoos. You weren't really aware of what a tattoo was. You saw that the girls had tattoos, but you weren't even sure that it was a permanent marking. I mean, did you really not know what a tattoo was?
Of course I knew what a tattoo was. But what I didn't know, which did surprise me, was that you just can't get rid of them. Because I had seen occasionally some of my children have a sort of temporary tattoo, which goes away, which was fun at the time. But I hadn't realised that everybody had a tattoo. It was quite an extraordinary day when it was quite hot and everyone came out in their sort of other swimsuits or whatever it is that they had, sort of vests, and realised that absolutely everybody except me had a tattoo.
Were you tempted? Were you tempted to get one?
They did try and encourage me to. I just managed to avoid it.
Obviously, a lot of the things you write about in your book, Prisonomics, and the things we're talking about are about that rehabilitation aspect of what happens to a prisoner afterwards, about the dysfunctional family lives they come from, the tough, the reasons they're in prison in the first place. What's your impression now of the aspect of being in prison being a punishment for the crime? Is it?
The greatest punishment is losing your liberty. But even people who have committed, quite serious crimes need rehabilitation. And the truth is that most people come out. So the most important thing is to ensure that as they come out, they become productive members of society and they don't reoffend. So in my view, while you're in prison, you do need to spend a lot of time with the prisoners. I have the type of service that allows for the right education, the right psychological support, to ensure that they do, when they come out, are in fact offer something back to society rather than just being a complete drain. So in my view, education, for example, and also quite a lot of sort of physical activities that help well-being quite significantly, are musts in prison. They're not privileges. Locking people up with nothing to do gives you nothing in return. And the interesting thing about prison is that it does not really act as deterrent for crime.
But that implies that prisoners are not sufficiently afraid, in some people's view, of going back to prison. What do you say to those people who'll say, well, it's clearly not tough enough. They wouldn't be reoffending if we made it unpleasant enough.
It's not the prison that is the issue. What stops people from offending is certainty that they're going to get caught, irrespective of what may happen afterwards. Most people who offend do not think they're going to get caught. In general, crimes are done either instinctively or with the complete optimism that they're not going to get caught. And that proves to be the case. If you actually look at the number of offences, they're hugely greater by a considerable multiple over the recorded crimes. And, of course, hugely greater than the crimes that are in fact dealt with and an offence is recorded finally as having led to maybe a custodial sentence or something else. So that people are offending all the time and they don't get caught.
You refer to that. You refer in your book to the fact that you had to see a probation officer and you were warned that, in fact, reoffending was something that generally happened at a higher rate in the second year of freedom than the first year. You jokingly say you probably won't recommit the offence for which you were imprisoned. But, Vicky, did you feel yourself that you were being punished?
Oh, taking away your liberties is serious punishment, yes. No doubt about it.
But did you, on a personal level, did you feel, gosh, if I hadn't done this, I wouldn't be going through this experience?
In a personal level, I felt that whatever they decided, I had to accept and get through it and survive, which is what I did. So didn't really think back on anything very much at all. I was, throughout that period, looking ahead. And I've continued
did you
to do
feel
that.
a sense of that you shouldn't be going to prison at any stage? Did you think this isn't fair? For what I did, I shouldn't be locked up?
I completely accepted it. Of course, loads of people felt that way and wrote to me about this, and my main preoccupation was tell them all just not to worry, calm down, and I would be fine. And my main worry about my children was that they would worry about me. So I had to spend quite a lot of time making sure that they knew I was okay. And the moment they realised I was okay and it was all going to be fine.
But that, again, that sounds like an intellectual decision. You must have been angry at some stage. Did you think, gosh, what the hell am I doing here?
Well, actually, I didn't feel angry. I accepted it entirely. So I got myself completely mentally prepared for it.
Even when you were in prison, there were never days when you felt angry?
No, you have your bad days, of course. But the other inmates, and we called residents, in fact, in East Sutton Park, in the open prison, it would sense when someone was down and they would do their best to get them out of it. And they were really quite amazing because obviously so much was written about this whole case and so much was being written too while I was in prison. So they would get up early in the morning, and I didn't realise that until later. They would rip out pages from the tabloids in particular with articles which they thought might upset me. One day I read something in the Telegraph that sort of semi-upset me, and I mentioned it at dinner. And they said, "Oh, God, we forgot to look at the Telegraph. We looked at all the other papers." But we used to get the tabloids, The Guardian and the Telegraph, every day. The atmosphere was such that people just helped whoever was down.
What kind of thing would have been upsetting? Was it the idea of people pontificating about your case, your family life, all these things that were brought out, very highly publicised stuff about your relationships within your family? Was it the nature of other people thinking they knew what went on in your head or in your family life? Was that what was upsetting, or was it just the fact that it had all happened?
No, there was a bit of that. People were writing all sorts of things which I didn't always recognise, but in reality and in relation to everything else that had happened, it didn't really matter, and I have no real issues with anyone who wrote anything. I don't begrudge any of the journalists, which of course allows you to get on with your life.
It's a healthy attitude
Yes.
if you can do it. What about the longer term consequences, though, not of the specifics in your private life of what happened, but in terms of the stigma of being a convicted criminal?
Well, it's very interesting you say that, because of course that's the problem that most girls that we're trying to help with working chance face. And I've got some figures in the book which show how prejudiced a number of employers are. They sort of throw out sort of immediately any application form that comes with anyone saying they have a conviction. But of course, in a number of cases, you don't have to declare anything. People would be surprised to know, which I have got in the book, that probably our supermarkets are the largest employers of ex-offenders because they don't ask generally any questions. And, the people who serve you are probably ex-offenders. They are normal human beings. They've done whatever they did. As I said before, many haven't been caught at all. Many more offences are being carried out all the time. And they have to come back. And the last thing you want is to have them as a drain on the economy. And it's pretty good to get employed. So that's quite difficult.
You address this. One of the things I found most interesting in the book, you address this very notion. A lot of people are frightened of the word criminal. But in fact, there are so many people with a criminal conviction. And I think someone you talk to in the book says, you're never more than 10 yards from someone with a criminal record, albeit sometimes from a relatively minor offence such as your own. And there are, of course, a larger number of people out there who are technically criminals but who've never been caught or convicted.
That's absolutely true. But on the evidence of at least recorded crimes, you still have a very, very large number who are currently working. So about a quarter of the working population have a criminal conviction, which is just extraordinary. The interesting thing is that it goes down after a certain age. The peak year seems to be 24 or 25. So an aging population reduces crime. But that's the general trend, which means that people carry this through their lives. They may have done sort of silly things when they were young, And a lot of crimes recorded when you're much younger, which happen when you're much younger, are not recorded at all. So you can imagine actually the number being hugely greater than any of the statistics at present show you.
What about for you? You have a professional career. Are there any specific consequences to people knowing that you have now a criminal record?
Well, there have been some knocks since I came out as well. But nevertheless, I mean, the interesting thing is that people have been very open and very kind in terms of asking me to do various things. And I think the fact that I'm an economist before anything else helps.
But are there things that you are not allowed to do because you've been in jail? You can't be a director of a company, can you?
No, I don't think they're in restrictions. I think you can do practically everything. I had quite a short sentence by comparison to others, and there's a threshold, and I think I'm under that, which is just fine.
Do you think there'll be some in the criminal justice system, people who work in this area already, who'll turn around and say, Vicky Pryce, what does she know? She had a very short sentence in a cushy environment. She's being opportunistic, even getting involved in this. She doesn't know what she's talking about.
Well, of course, they'll be entitled to say what they like. And it is true I haven't been there long enough, and I've privileged in a way that I hadn't been there, spending all my time in a closed prison for too long. But you can actually sense Holloway immediately. But of course, I have spoken to so many people who were in there and to so many people on the outside who've been putting the figures together. And what I have is the ability as an economist to express things in a slightly different way and tell the stories of people who wouldn't be able to tell the story otherwise. If you stay in prison for a long period of time, of course, some of the women I met end up with serious health and mental problems. And that isn't widely understood. I've tried to say a bit of that in the book. And having been there, even for a relatively short period of time, at least gave me an insight that I was then able to work on with a lot of help from the outside, including lots of academics who looked at everything that moves in terms of the literature in this area.
It's clearly a world you would never have imagined yourself getting involved in. Are you going to be ultra cautious now about never doing anything that might result in you going back to prison?
Well, it's very interesting you say that. One of my other concerns in prison, apart from making sure that everyone knew I was okay, was the discovery of how easy it is to move from being normal to being an offender, or at least to be labelled as such. And I was hearing stories of people having gone out to a pub, a girl with loads of boys, including her boyfriend, and then there'd be some big fight with another gang, and there'd be knifings and so on that took place, and they ended up being in for joint enterprise possibly, just for going out one night to a pub. So I was thinking of writing to my children and saying, don't leave the house. It's so easy to move from being just like everybody else, or so we think, to having this label and ending time being in prison. So you do have this concern. And I wander around and I look at things and events happening around me very differently now than I did before. But what it also does, of course, is it changes your priorities. You realise what's really important in terms of relationships, family, and you worry less about some of the other things. But it has completely changed my perspective of life.
Vicky Pryce, thank you for talking about your experiences in prison and about your new book, Prisonomics. I'm Tim Ecott, and you've been listening to In Conversation.